come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Hi, and welcome to Just Breathe. We are a podcast for those who are involved in the world of Unitarian Universalist religious education, youth, and emerging adults, and really anyone who likes to talk about Unitarian Universalism. I am Ember Kelly. I use she and her pronouns. I am a white trans woman with a very plain background behind me. I am wearing a burgundy dress. I have shoulder-length graying brown hair, and I wear glasses as well. We're including visual descriptions because we are available both as a audio podcast and as a video podcast. So if you've not checked out our YouTube, make sure to check us out there as well. If you have somehow, in the random stream of recommended podcasts, stumbled upon this podcast and know nothing about Unitarian Universalism, we're glad you're here, and we hope you stick around to hear a little bit more. And if you'd like to hear a little bit more about Unitarian Universalism, make sure to head to uua.org. And I'm joined today by our amazing second host, Joy Barry.
Hi, Amber. Always good to be with you. Yes, we have such an exciting show today. I am Joy Barry, she, her. I am a middle-aged, white-appearing woman with a warm yellow background behind me with some paper-cut art, a headscarf, and some big, big glasses and a dark denim shirt. I am the Children and Families Faith Development Specialist at the Lifespan Faith Engagement Office of the UUA. I'm so glad they don't charge us by the letter to talk about that. I am so happy today that we're going to be talking about equity, and we have three fantastic guests with us who are going to be sharing their thoughts and their ideas. And that is Catherine Childs, Renwa Hamemi, and H.P. Rivers, and they'll have a chance to tell us a little bit about themselves and their work in Unitarian Universalism as well. So just a word about equity from our new shared values language from the adopted Article 2 bylaw. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. So quite a bit to unpack there, I feel like. I immediately want to get out my red pen and ask questions. And I'm so glad that we have our guests here to help us do that today. So I want to ask Miss Catherine Childs to begin for us, if you would.
Hello, my name is Catherine Childs. My pronouns are they and them. I am a tall, you can't really see that because I'm sitting down, fat, white, non-binary person with short pink hair. Today I'm wearing wireframe glasses and a plaid shirt. I am in my early 40s. Behind me you can see some fairy lights and a rainbow Black Lives Matter sign and a rainbow bee, my little friend sitting behind me. And I am the Director of Religious Explorations at the Unitarian Church of Montreal in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And I am also in the third year of my presidency of LREDA, the Liberal Religious Educators Association, which is our professional association for religious educators in UUA and CUC congregations. And I'm so happy to be with all of you to talk about equity today. Joy had asked us to offer some initial reflections on the value of equity. And one of the things that I've really been thinking about as we explore the new values language, and specifically this value, is the idea of what would it mean to apply the equity language and the equity concept to our children and youth involvement in our congregations. What does it mean to treat those populations within our communities as having equity of participation and of flourishing within what we do as a denomination? And I'm really excited to explore that idea because I think it gives us a really wonderful new way to explore ideas of how children and youth can be involved in our congregation. So maybe I'll leave it there, and I'm sure Joy's going to call on our next guest.
Yeah. HP, you want to go next?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for having me. My name is Helen or HP Rivers. My pronouns are they, she, or anything offered with love. They, them feels best, but I usually don't have the energy to fight people on it. I am a white non-binary femme. I'm wearing clear glasses and pink earrings shaped like guillotines today. And I have a whole lot of gorgeous art behind me, and a lot of it is by a UU raised artist who's one of my good friends. And oh gosh, what do I do? I do a lot of things. I am a religious educator and curriculum developer. I just finished working on the UUA's Mosaic Anti-Race Lifespan Anti-Racism curriculum, which I edited and contributed to. I'm also the owner of Blessed Be by HP Rivers, your favorite UU gift shop. And I am a minister in formation currently in my ministerial internship in a community-based setting here in Knoxville, Tennessee, and utilizing social media as part of my internship in ministry. Phew. I'm always tired, and I have a kid. I'm always tired. Um, um, I'm approaching this conversation on equity from a place of exploring the financial systems at play in our congregations and the dynamics at play, especially when we're thinking about the ministerial formation process and how much money that costs. It costs about $100,000 beginning to end to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. And that really begs the question for me, who do we want to be leading us? Who are we seeking out? Who was this process created for, and who is being excluded the way that it currently exists? So I've done a lot of work around that, and I'm excited to be here with y'all.
Renoir.
Hey everyone, I am Ranour Hamami. My pronouns are they, them. Quick visual description. I am a light brown skinned person of Egyptian and Lebanese descent. I have dark brown hair that's currently pulled back into a ponytail. I am wearing a red shirt or a maroon shirt that has a pink heart and pink words that say abolition is love on it. I'm wearing red glasses, and behind me, in my home office, you can see my bookcases with a lot of books I aspire to read, various justice accoutrements, my kafaya, and a bunch of stuffies on the lower shelves because I too have a child who sometimes has to sit in this office with me. Yeah, so this question about equity. So I'm also oh, I guess I should share a little bit more about who I am in the UU world. So I'm an ordained UU minister. I serve on the organizing strategy team, the Side with Love organizing strategy team at the Unitarian Universalist Association. That's a whole lot of words. I wish I was paid by word on that one. And I serve as the congregational justice organizer. And in that role, I am supporting congregations in their organizing through coaching, through collaborative development of programs and resources with other members of the organizing strategy team at the UUA. And so excited to be here with religious educators because you are our theologians in many ways. So coming into this question. Oh, I am a Muslim Unitarian Universalist, so it's Ramadan. So right now, I'm reading the Quran each night, trying to get through it. We'll see if I make it work. But there was actually a verse that from last night that was like, well, I'm bringing this in today, in the Quran, which was, uh, Allah did not create all of these without purpose and balance. God explains the signs in detail to those who understand. And this is talking about how our world was initially created with a level of balance and equity, was created with a divine purpose so that all can thrive and flourish and can support the creation for those who are coming next. And so when I think about what this means for equity, y'all, we are so out of balance in this world. And so how do we come back into balance? How do we use a radical imagination to come back into balance and not try to make things the way they were as they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1492 years ago. You know, how are we having a radical imagination to really create balance that serves everybody?
Ooh, that leads in perfectly to the question that had prepared to start us today. So in the wording of the value, it says, "We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness." And when I was preparing thoughts for this podcast, the thing that really stuck with me was this, that every person has the right to flourish. So I'm curious, thinking about flourishing, what visions for the future does that bring for you as an individual? What could that look like, maybe on like a personal level, on a cultural level, on a now and future level? There's lots of directions that you could take that, but I would love to hear what visions of flourishing look like for you.
I'm thinking about this as a neurodivergent person and thinking about how flourishing for me is so different from others. Flourishing for me includes like going nonverbal on my couch for a little while every day and having space to process, having accommodations. And I think as you use, we get a little stuck sometimes when something is aspirational, such as our values and principles. The idea of equity is aspirational. It's not something that we're necessarily doing great all of the time. And then we get that neurodivergent urge to give up when it's too hard or too much or too overwhelming. And I think it's really important to continuously remind ourselves that we're not going to do any of this perfectly and we don't have to. And it doesn't have to look or be any one type of way. It can be what works for a specific individual, family, or community.
I mean, I think that's fundamentally what distinguishes like flourishing from survival, right? It is the idea that we can create systems which allow everybody to have an equal amount of bread and water every day. But when we talk about flourishing and we talk about equity as opposed to equality, we are talking about a system and a way of being in which individual needs are met and that we meet a collective need by meeting individual needs, as opposed to trying to meet a collective need and then like figure out how to make it work for everybody individually after the fact. And I mean, you use love individuality, man, like more than anything else. And I wonder about sort of leveraging that instinct into something that gets us closer to the actual aspiration of equity. If we have this opportunity to leverage that sense of individuality and also a sense of compassion and empathy and bring those together, to get us closer to that flourishing point, that equity point that we're reaching for.
Yeah, hearing both of you talk, I think about the ways in which celebrating like that diverse tapestry of who we are also involves creating those systems and structures of care that really can catch and hold all of the different needs and all of the different opportunities that we all bring into community. There's a tool that we use on the organizing strategy team that our climate organizer, Rachel Mislivy, brought to us called a rich picture. And in it, people literally draw, no words. I fight that so hard. Um, a picture of what they imagine the world with love at the center can look like. And as Nicole Presley, our director, team director, has said, nobody ever draws a jail. And so it's kind of that, like, what are people drawing instead of that? And so, yeah, I'm thinking about how are we creating those systems of care, even in those fractal moments. How are we creating those building blocks within our local communities? Doing visual descriptions on a Zoom call is one of those fractals that we're doing here. Having some form of mutual aid, building arts and creativity into our community spaces. How are we creating those sort of local opportunities of care to start to shift that global imbalance that I was thinking about earlier. So that's where I go with that.
I think what comes up for me is how much work the word right is doing in the statement you know, we declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. It makes me think a little bit about, especially so many southern states where I'm from, and their right to work, right? It's easy to use that word right, but we know it's always sort of, the twin of responsibility. And to name that we have a right is to open up a box of a lot of other questions about what does a right compel us to do as individuals and as a community. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can build and sustain more fully inclusive and accessible communities. But I'm thinking about HP's reference to the couch and wondering that while I absolutely affirm their right to do that on the couch, I'm wondering how we take that in deeply enough to begin to see sort of, I guess, what C.B. Bill coined preemptive radical inclusion, you know, so that that right has a meaning for us as a denomination or as a community. So I'm just really interested in the tension between rights and responsibilities. Yeah, I think I'll stop there because it elicits some bubbles in me that I want to give space to emerge. What about you, Ember?
As you were talking, one of the things that came to mind is, probably heard it in a million different formats, the idea that, being more accessible benefits us all. But I've seen that play out in I'm very passionate about intergenerational, multi-generational worship, youth-centered worship, however you want to call the different manifestations that they've been in UU history. And that's always something that has been something that I've been really interested in. But part of the reason is that it challenges like the ways that we typically often perceive what Sunday worship needs to be like. And it's always interesting that people who maybe might have had issues with it beforehand, they do it and they're like, wow, like that was a really moving service and I had a really great experience and it was nice to get to do these different things. It's like, hey, like you actually benefit by having like a more inclusive style of worship. Imagine that. Like imagine that we all benefit when everyone has the opportunity to flourish.
Mm.
And so I suppose that's what came up as you were talking there, Joy. But to me, I think it's almost a little bit of a mindset shift that we have to make this because of the right to flourish and this responsibility related with that. I think connects with also like the inherent dignity that it is in this language. Like to view all the members of our community, to view all the members of the world, even perhaps, as people who have dignity besides something that they're doing for us is very, um, it's very counter to our tendencies in both our individualism and in our consumerist capitalist culture, where it's like, hey, what do you bring me? What value do you bring me in life? And to instead have this mindset shift to just seeing people as having their own inherent dignity is a really big difference. So I'm curious if folks, what kind of work do we need to be doing to be making this shift to viewing others with their own inherent worth and dignity? How do we value all humans? How do we fix all of the problems of the world? If you could sum that up in a few sentences or less.
I got you. I got you. Uh, no, the idea of the mindset shift, I got me thinking about sort of metrics for things like this. Like we talk about like, okay, so it costs us money to have whatever accessibility feature, right? And like the next thing that's gonna happen, absolutely, is somebody's gonna be like, but how many people are actually benefiting from this thing? Like, right? And we get trapped in like because we all have to live under capitalism, right? Like even those of us who work in non-capitalist, technically speaking, structures, like we all actually still have limited amounts of time, limited amounts of resources, and we need to make decisions about those things. And the temptation to be like, well, only one person is low vision and is attending, so why are we doing a visual description? Like the part of the mindset shift, part of valuing equity is to take the cost benefit part out of the question. And I realize that that presents logistical challenges because we do need metrics based on which we make decisions. But part of equity is having different metrics to make the decisions. Part of saying we want to create a system not in which we offer the same thing to everybody, but in which everybody has an opportunity to access the thing. It's a different way of thinking about what success looks like. It's a different way of thinking about how we use our resources and what it means to use our resources in ways that advance equity, whether or not X number of people are benefiting from them or not.
Remember you asked about, what do we do about it? And I've been working with young adults through Yarn as chaplain for the last several months. And the most common conversation I have with people is where they're grappling with their own inherent worth and dignity. And we see this so much, especially with folks who have experienced religious trauma, who have come from traditions where they have been told from birth, hey, you're wrong. What you are is wrong. What you are is not okay. You have to repent. And like, I know Joy's also in the South. Like, I didn't even grow up churched, and I got so much of that culture because it's just everywhere. That idea that we are inherently bad is just everywhere. And that's something that a lot of folks who have come into the tradition, maybe weren't raised in it, are still really grappling with. So a lot of us are entering the conversation from a lot of different points. And if someone doesn't believe in their own inherent worth and dignity, don't trust in their own inherent worth and dignity, then how can we expect them to believe in someone else's and work for someone else's when they're still working through the hurt of separation from community and the hurt of being told that God doesn't love them, or whatever that, verbiage is for their tradition?
I think about it's sort of putting the what both of you have said again in dialogue, that let's say you're in that community where somebody says, well, we only have one person who needs this like this shift in our culture. Why? And to that idea of, well, some people are constantly told you don't have, whether it's verbally or in how our culture is shaped, you don't have inherent worth and dignity. If we are deciding not to shift our culture to include more people, we are actively telling people you don't have inherent worth and dignity. And so I think like it's important for us to look at the ways in which we are not living into acknowledging this right, not living into our responsibility to ensure that nobody's right to have their inherent worth and dignity is taken away from them. There's a lot of that in the Quran. I'm very Quran minded this month. Sorry, y'all. But there's a lot of that about like the disbelievers, the worst of us are the ones who prevent people from having access to the holy. And so that is something that I think we are equipped to engage in truly liberative ways, to encourage people to have more access to the holy. And then when we do that, we find out that they have new resources and new ways of imagining and being together when we invite more people in and actually create that community.
I have more of a comment than a question. The word holy offends me. And I would really like it if, when we move from the aspirational and the idealistic conversation and start actually examining, the log in our own eye, to use my biblical upbringing language, it becomes a much more fraught conversation. And it's in those kinds of conversations where we are able to reflect on how we might mind the gap between our aspirations and our lives that we are doing faith formation. I'm thinking about the question of metrics and how it is so embedded in us that that's clearly one of the top priorities for how we should lead the conversation, right? I mean, like, yeah, rational. Let's be rational, people. We got to keep the lights on. And yet we have this failure of what Renoir called the radical imagination. And first, just radical, the word means root, you know, which is so wonderful because we're deeply rooted in in this value here. But it it's a failure of imagination that we don't have a kind of spiritual math that tells us how to compute who we don't see and might, who we might engage but can't, who we might gather in and be changed by but won't, if we don't change to become more accessible. You know, we're not meant to be handmaidens to the reproduction of white supremacy culture in Unitarian Universalism. I feel pretty sure about that, although I'm not a theologian. I am a religious educator. And I know that whenever we start to model and live in ways that lift multicultural values, for example, where equity is deeply centered, we will combat the biases, the unconscious tendencies to center certain normative individuals' ways of being, ways of learning. To me, and I think a lot of religious educators in particular, it's a no-brainer that we need to be accessible and inclusive. But one can't even say that without an immediate acknowledgement of how much that kind of very wholesome change activates many in our communities. And so we can't even get to the question of how might we change and be changed with more accessibility. And I just want to name that, of course, most of the ways we could be most deeply accessible and inclusive and welcoming immediately don't cost anything. It does, however, require us to think a little bit or a lot more carefully with a shared ministry approach, in congregations at least, about how we want to present ourselves and this community and what's possible with the multiplication of our efforts. So those are some of the things that come up for me, because I keep thinking about that next line: we covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. I immediately think about the way that religious educators and the project of religious education naturally moves us in this direction. Because when we say we are a community of communities and that we are all made better and more whole by our shared faith development in a variety of ways in congregational culture, it encourages us to see how we have, to my mind, one of our communities that should be centered is literally siloed. Because I'm thinking about how many right now, one of the most common things I get in my email is questions about what do we do about all these neurodivergent kids? And the adults can't handle it. And so, you know, that doesn't cost anything to engage in the kind of faith development that builds connection and sides with love and understands that there's a Unitarian Universalism out there waiting and praying for us to get to it, to make it to the future. But it sure does create a lot of feelings in a lot of folks. And it does seem to be linked, at least in some way, to money and power. And I'm kind of wondering what y'all think about that. We covenant to use all these things, time, talent, treasure, to build truly inclusive communities. And I just can't help but think about the role of religious education and the religious education community in our congregations. I'm wondering what y'all think about that.
I think a great place to start is looking at how we treat our staff and what our staff policies are. When you make the religious educator beg for their job every year, basically fundraise for their job and have to be on their best behavior during Canvas season and make sure that they don't make the biggest donors mad, even if they haven't engaged in religious education for 30 years, that's an abusive dynamic. And that's somewhere that we really need to pay attention. As a business owner, I know that if I take care of my vendors, my contractors, my employees, they will take care of my organization. And when we take care of our staff, when we pay them equitably, when we give them professional expenses, when we give them enough hours in the week to actually complete their really important jobs, then we are living into that. And that's a way that I've noticed some of us have been able to kind of start those conversations in conversations about our own compensation, our own work environments. But it's really stressful when you are a part-time employee and your contract is up for negotiation every year, and it's not up for negotiation with the board. It's up for negotiation for the from the entire congregation, and they can decide whether or not they want you to still have a job. And you are expected to have just the utmost professionalism, and but they aren't. And your inherent worth and dignity isn't necessarily being held. We don't necessarily think about the inherent worth and dignity of our leaders because we view them as consumables. And that's a really big thing for us to grapple with. And I'm going to get off that soapbox because I could stay there all day.
The thing that really came to mind for me is really wondering how good we are at creating adults within our communities who actually understand their own spiritual needs. I think that we have seen many knock-on effects of the lack of religious education for adults, the lack of valuing religious education for adults, especially for people who come into our communities as adults and don't benefit from religious education programs that are offered to children. I will say from my own experience as someone who was not raised UU, the commenters have a tendency to feel like their spiritual needs are being met just by being present in the community because it's such a huge difference from whatever they have experienced in the past, whether that is the experience of an abusive religious community or the lack of a religious community. And when you figure out that that is something that you are craving in your life, and then you get it, whether or not you are actually being an active participant in meeting your own spiritual needs, whether you are investing in your community in a way that is investing in meeting your own spiritual needs, you have to be able to identify what those are. And I think so many people come into our communities in a state of spiritual crisis, and they think arrival is the end point. And it means that we're not cultivating a community approach to meeting those spiritual needs, to identifying spiritual needs, and to identifying how spiritual needs are different across the lifespan, across life experiences, and across all of the axes of diversity that we can imagine within our communities. And I wonder about what the impact would be of adults getting clear on these questions as opposed to feeling like they don't need to ask them anymore once they've shown up.
I just want to lean in real quick to say, I just put a link into our chat so we can put it into the show notes. But, if you really wanted to look at equity, understanding that what this panel and threshold conversations, which included ministers and religious educators, what they call the remedial need for adult faith development is a really important thing to be activated enough to look at when we start to think about equity, right? Because it definitely goes both ways, as you're saying, in that our adults have some needs that are unmet. And I wonder how we could, by being more inclusive, heal some deeply sacred wounds that they bring to us. Because yeah, they love what they find at the UU Church until something doesn't go their way, right? Like stage 4, faith is sought, but also fought. And that's where we start to see folks will either go deeper and become covenantal, or they'll start to feel like, wait a second, I thought you were X, and actually you're X plus Y plus Z, and that's not working for me. So yeah, the lack of faith development there can be a real hurdle for helping those folks go deeper in their own faith development. I really want to thank you for lifting that.
Yeah, I want to sort of defer mostly to what y'all have said as the religious educators, the formal religious educators in the room. And we'll just add a small bit about how, coming back to how we are all living and learning within a world that has taught us that certain things are the norm, that certain things are the way things should be. And so for religious education to truly be something we engage in as a lifelong faith formation practice, how are we unlearning some of the things that we have learned when we come as we are coming into the congregation, into the community, how we're at and staying in the congregation, the community, using those moments of, oh, this sits uncomfortably with me, to go deeper into why is it sitting uncomfortably with me, and to unlearn some of those things that have led to, again, that sort of imbalance that exists, and to create something different.
I love that. The sitting with the discomfort is not something that many Americans who fit the kind of UU demographic profile, we are not apprentice to sitting with our discomfort, right? And that's part of what faith formation does for us, is open us up and bring so many things out into the light of our own contemplation and community, because we need each other to get better, right? We need each other to do church. I love how we have focused a lot on the faith formation competency, the unique competency of congregational life that is faith formation, and the need to center that, and how equity both calls us to do that and promotes it when we do great inclusive whole church approaches to religious education. I can't help, though, and I don't know as much about this as some of you may, but I can't help but wonder about how our endowment and equity fit together. I tend to think about our deepest and most valuable endowment being literally the children and families and young adults who are with us now, who are making a bet on us that we're going to get better, and therefore that we will exist in the future. Um, but I know that but I know that that's not the only endowment that we have, and I noticed that our endowment is staying very, very strong despite other issues with attendance and giving and all that in our denomination. I wonder if any of you have thought more deeply about this, and I want to do my own learning on this. So I just want to be clear that I'm learning here. So what do any of you have to say about it?
All right, I'll go first as a UUA employee who hopefully won't lose my job with anything I might say here. First of all, I absolutely love how you flipped that definition of what an endowment can be. Because again, we are working with a particular, we can, like, my mind immediately went to the what's sitting in that bank account definition of endowment. And you're suggesting that the endowment is about what we are cultivating and leaving behind, and creating for more folks to engage with and thrive and flourish, coming back to equity. And so I will say the spicy thing, a financial endowment kind of feels like we're buying into a toxic system. And that's I understand. We live in a capitalist world, a capitalist environment. There are some things like I need to pay the bills, so I know that that endowment's going to sit there and pay my salary, worst case scenario. And how are we shifting those resources to create new resources, like the communities that will provide care and bring groceries should I no longer have a job? How are we moving those resources that are a toxic resource into a life-giving resource?
Like how can we leverage the filthy lucre towards, yeah, faith development and community, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about this time that I worked for a congregation that had a multi-million-dollar endowment, and the office administrator and I were both on food stamps. It's just that juxtaposition. And I think, like, so many, you know what, I'll say the scary thing because I'm not a UUA staff. I think endowment guillotines. I think this is the rainy day. This is the moment that we've been waiting for. Like, yes, of course, it's important to have a rainy day fund and not dip into it so much. We have millions of dollars sitting in bank accounts that could be funding so much right now. Could be funding trans families fleeing the country, could be funding clinical pastoral education for students, for UU ministers, information, so they don't have to pay for it. A colleague and I just crowdfunded about $6,000 for both of us to get through a CPE unit. And most other denominations pay for that kind of stuff for their ministers and formation. So when we're thinking about like so many of our congregations have a big chunk of money sitting there, and that's their security. That's in the past, and that money does equal security in this capitalistic system. It makes sense that we're terrified to spend it. We're terrified of not having enough. But that's where the trust and the love and the covenant comes in. We have to trust that there is actually enough for everybody. And there, we don't have to hoard it. We don't have to hide it. We can actually do what we say we want to do out in the world. We just have to be willing to fund it. And that's terrifying. I think the biggest thing so many of our congregations need to work through is trauma around money, trauma around being in community, trauma around being wrong, trauma around growing irrelevant or fear of growing irrelevant, and trauma of fear of change. And if we can get people to work with their trauma, then we can do so much more. But so much of the time we're just stuck in trauma responses, and we're having endless committee meetings that are really just trauma responses.
We just got the 2 minutes, so maybe I will finish up with one last thought about endowment, which is that we create endowment funds as a way to stopgap against the future. And I wonder what stopgapping against the future outside of financial considerations looks like. What does it look like to make an endowment for the future of UUism that is about people and culture and the central love and spirit of that movement, as opposed to about a financial stopgap? And what would it mean to shift our thinking about preparing for the future beyond just the money question?
Well, the money question and helping our seminarians feels particularly relevant as I get ready whenever the government deems the SAVE plan done, and such things. I get different emails, every few months telling me what my situation will be, but tentatively getting prepared for a $550 bill increase because I went to seminary, and that's what life will do to you. But I had some conversations uh, with my mom about like student loans and things like that, and I was like there wasn't any alternate path to becoming a minister, to being involved in the work of a church. You had to do this. There wasn't like will pay. And I grew up in the evangelical world, and I've even seen some evangelicals being like, yeah, we have to like figure out an alternate way to do this. Like this isn't good for people. This is not sustainable long term. So all of that just feels super relevant. But I think to close on a not worried about student loans note, when thinking about big congregations with lots of financial resources, I was also thinking about some of my own experiences, whether growing up in an evangelical, small, like 40-person fellowship, or being involved in some UU smaller communities as well. One of the messages that I've always tried to convey when working in those spaces is that you don't need to be like these big mega churches. You don't need to be out, spending a bunch on things. But what can you do to be in your community, to be an endowment to your community? What can you do that is bringing value that will then cause people to consider UUism as something that has value for them to consider maybe attending? I think in my experiences across, I've collected more denominations than one can count. Luckily, now that I'm UU, I can jump around religiously without having to jump around to a new community. So that's a real win for me. But one of the things that I've seen across all of those is I've watched these communities not want to invest in the future, not want to consider what would make things. I don't want to say more appealing. That sounds very capitalist of me, but what would make things more accessible? What would make things more dynamic? What would help them actually be engaged in outreach and ministry versus, let's invest in the carpet in the sanctuary. Priorities were not always there. And then, 5, 10 years later, they wonder why the numbers are dwindling and why people aren't ever interested in coming into their building. So it really is important for us to turn around and frame the endowment and the things that we consider about how we're investing in the future.
Yes. And I really want you to think more about cultural perpetuity, because sometimes it really does seem like we're cosplaying for a really big, nice memorial service. And when we act as if we want to be thriving and flourishing with room for all 20, 50, 100 years from now, it's going to make us think, act, spend, and serve differently, hopefully with equity for all. I am so thankful for this conversation today, and some of the things that we mentioned we'll be putting into the show notes so that our viewers and listeners can learn a little bit more. What else have we got going on, Ember? Keep me on track.
That's my job. It's actually in my formal job description. Ember keeps Joy on track. No. Our next Just Breathe in April will be exploring interdependence. Maybe, we're actually gonna, make a sequel movie called Interdependence Day. That'll be, one of our special side projects, Joy. But we're going to be joined by panelists Jill Novinsky and Reverend Jim Lewis. We're really excited for continuing these conversations on this season of Just Breathe. This has just been personally a beautiful project to be involved on this year as we consider these values. If you're following us, be sure to like and subscribe to the page on YouTube. Give us a follow on Instagram, where we are Just Breathe Pod. Don't forget the 2 U's, because it can't be UU if it's not JUUST. Breathe Pod. And spread the word about your new favorite UU podcast.
Thanks, y'all.
Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery.